Hello and welcome to the Nano Film Improv Podcast. I'm Dave Heron. This podcast is about my trials and tribulations associated with improv comedy and doing it, performing it, rehearsing it. So this is really a cathartic outpouring of the things that I've learned, the things that I'm struggling with, and an opportunity to share with you and hear from you also some of the things that have worked for you, and equally there'll be some things on this podcast that you have tried that don't work for you. It's all very subjective. My experience level is, well, I've had a few years experience doing improv. I've taught a bit of improv. I've performed with a whole range of exciting and talented improvisers and learnt from sets that have gone well and sets that haven't gone well. And this is all part of an evolution for me as well. So you're very welcome in joining me on this podcast. So for this episode, I want to talk about peak performance. This is about giving the very best performance that I can do every single time I go on stage. My goal with improv is to be the very best that I can possibly be with it. So whilst this is a journey, every single time I go on stage, I want that set, that show, to be absolutely knockout. And if it isn't, then that's something that I hold myself to. And that's really my goal or my objective every time I do it. Whilst I do have a lot of fun, there is a more serious side for me that I want to perform very, very well indeed and get very, very good at doing this art form. But this week, I want to focus on how can I maximize and be the very best at performing. I recently had a gig with two very good friends of mine under We Are Dave, Emily Joy and Lewis Hill. And before we went on stage, we hadn't rehearsed for quite a few weeks actually. I think we'd had one rehearsal in a back room in a Crawley Starbucks as a very quick rehearsal because we hadn't met each other for quite a while. But I remember we went on stage and I said, right, the main thing that we've just got to focus on is make sure we get on together. We were doing a 3-prov show where 3 people perform improv, do a long 1-act, 1-scene show for 15-20 minutes. And I said, just make sure we just focus on making sure that we get on together first and foremost. Once we get on and we find ourselves happy together as characters, then we can find the things that set us apart. But immediately, as soon as the scene started, I immediately said, why are you sweeping something over my feet? Emily was motioning some sweeping movement as though she was sweeping the floor, and I immediately challenged her. So immediately, as the scene had started, I went back on the thing that I had been saying that we needed to focus on, and that was getting on with each other. So immediately in my head, I was thinking, what are you doing, Dave? Why are you messing this up? Now, wonderfully, Lewis came in and brought us all together with a big hug and said, come on, guys, let's all get on. We've all got to work here together. We may as well see eye to eye on things. Of course, that was a wonderful reminder as an improviser from him to me to say, come on, let's make sure we get on as characters first of all. But I remember feeling so annoyed with myself that I'd let myself down. And then maybe a few days later actually, I was listening to a podcast, What Goes On Tour Rugby podcast. Now, a few of you know that I am very much into rugby, mainly because my son does it. I did a little bit at school, but I was never really particularly good and therefore gave it up as other players got a lot bigger and faster. But my son has been quite good at rugby. He's 12 right now, and we've shared a passion for rugby. In particular, Bath Rugby has become our rugby club, and at this current point in time, Bath Rugby are doing exceptionally well. They are run by a South African, Johann Van Graan, and if you listen to Johann speak in quite a few podcasts or indeed interviews afterwards, he's a very calm, in control character. You listen to what he says. And he did a podcast recently, this What Goes On Tour South African podcast. You can find it on YouTube. And in this podcast, he talks about peak performance of his rugby side. And the synergies between playing rugby and being the very best that you can be at rugby and improv were quite astonishing for me. He talked a lot about everything being ready for the 3 p.m. Saturday kickoff. And you could read that, for me, as being ready for the upcoming gig. Making sure you've booked a gig, it's in 2 weeks' time, you've got enough rehearsal time, you've got enough time to work with the other improvisers rather than just simply stepping on stage and hoping it will happen. He talks about those players in his squad who turn up. In particular, there's a prop, if you know your rugby, there's a prop, South African prop called Thomas de Toit, who he claims turns up every single time for training. Now, what he means by that, obviously, is not he just turns up literally. What he's talking about is every single time it requires somebody to step up to the plate and really deliver in terms of rugby. He's talking about those types of players. And I see it exactly the same as well. I've been in groups before where rehearsals haven't taken place. And what happens is the performance, the show, the set is somewhat lackluster because they haven't rehearsed. They haven't got that connection. One of the things I've spoken about on this podcast before as well. So players who are consistently turning up, or improvisers who are always showing up for rehearsal and making sure that they also want to be the best that they can be as well. And so everything that he spoke about in this podcast about peak performance, getting ready for the 3 o'clock kickoff, having those players or improvisers who always turn up, who are always rehearsing, always wanting to make sure that the show that they put on is the best show, because a lot of the times people are paying money for these tickets as well. So I want to make sure myself that anyone who comes to see my show always sees the best set that it can be. I remember about 20 years ago having some actor friends at university, and they spoke about how you could never have a show where an audience member shows up and then the actor says afterwards, "Oh, yes, you didn't come to the best night. I was better the night before." Should never be in that situation. It should always be a peak performance. And that's exactly what I want to do. So I was really inspired by that podcast. And there was a lot of synergy between being a rugby player and being a high level quality rugby player and a high level improviser where you want every single show to be absolutely spot on. So if you wanted to go and listen to it, I would highly recommend it. It's called What Goes on Tour. I think it's episode 5 with Johann Van Graan. And you can see that there are lots of things about how to be the best that you can be. Whilst the focus is about rugby, clearly there are synergies across other areas of life as well, in particular being the best improviser that I can possibly be. So that's one of the things that I really want to focus on into 2025 is showing up, being there at rehearsals and giving the very, very best that I can be, making sure when I've got gigs booked, we've got rehearsals properly booked in and people show up to those rehearsals as well. Again, you can only do so much on your side. Equally, if you're part of a group, you also need everybody to commit to that vision as well. If not everyone is committed to that vision, you might understand that actually they have different objectives. They might just want to do improv for a bit of fun. They might not be taking it as seriously as you might want to take it. And there's nothing wrong in that at all. It's just making sure that your objectives first and foremost are aligned. And I want to make sure that when I have a gig again, I've had enough rehearsal time that I'm on my peak performance and giving the very best that I can give as an improviser. Have you got any tricks or tips for how to get better? Clearly, rehearsing is obviously a bit of a 101, but have you experienced similar types of challenges? Do you find it difficult to get rehearsal time with your group together? What sort of things have you tried to get that commitment level right so that you can give the best performance that you want to be able to give as an improviser? I'd love to hear what you've worked through.
So thanks very much for listening to the Nano Film Improv podcast, and I'll catch you in the next one.